All right. Thanking God for the way that he ideally, gently guides us into truth. Let's call chapter 9, famous chapter. Disciples, understanding that once again, it's going to seem that a portion of the crowds has fallen into an identity crisis as to whose disciples they actually are, believing they are disciples of Moses. The question is whether or not that's actually true. In the chapter that famously starts out with Jesus healing the man born blind, in a chapter that brings to light a lot of the questions, once again, about who the Christ actually is. And the questions seem to be a good way to actually organize a description of the chapter, understanding that the chapter starts out with maybe not so famous, or depending upon how many times you've seen the story, maybe just as famous a question. Who sinned that this man was born blind, either this man or his parents? His apostles are going to ask him, or his disciples, it's literally going to say, are going to ask him. And he's going to say in verse 3, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed. First question answered as Christ goes on to heal the man in the first 7 verses, as he's going to go on to provide fodder for a lot more questions in the chapter, verses 8 through 12, provoking questions from those who knew that the man, or that there had been a man who was blind from birth, but this guy's seeing. And so they're like, is this the same guy? He's going to say, I am the man, in verse 9, eventually convincing them that he might be the man, but not necessarily convincing everyone, as verse 13 is going to show us how the Pharisees bring the man before them to inquire, how did this happen? Since they are not going to necessarily believe. So they're going to question him in verses 13 through 17. Then in verses 18 through 23, it's going to seem that they bring his parents to question them, basically wondering the same thing. How then does he now see if he was born blind? In verse 19, that's the question. His parents are going to be reluctant to give them a candid answer because they are tossing people out of the synagogue if they are confessing Jesus as the Christ, and they seem to want to stay far away from that kind of drama. So then they're going to bring him back in a second time in verse 24, going from verses 24 through roughly 34, then arguing that the man, who has seemingly quite a bit more courage than his parents, is going to speak up for himself. And they're going to pose essentially the same question all over again. What did he do to you, and how did he open your eyes? Provoking him to observe during the course of their discussion. It's ironic that you're saying you can't understand where this man came from, since, as we mentioned before, maybe a little bit in the sermon, since the beginning of time, we have not seen anybody who's been able to do these kinds of things. And so if nothing else, it might be a hint, my paraphrase. But either way, the course of the conversation and the man's confidence to speak up, at least to the truth that he perceives, not scared to even give his opinion, that this might be something miraculous, is going to be enough to get him booted out of that gathering, and quite likely the synagogue, at least if not the temple, as his parents had feared. But Jesus is going to circle back around to find the young man and entertain, or at least pose, one more question in verse 35. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Provoking this man who has already shown an inclination towards honesty and being willing to not look at the narrow set of facts that would have kept him in the fellowship of the synagogue, but in talking to the Christ, he is now willing to take the reality that he can now see, as the famous passage goes. In answering the Pharisees in verse 25, he is going to say, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Leading to the final confrontation, because Jesus is then going to work towards the conclusion of the chapter in a very important verse, one that I think sums up what caught my attention most about this chapter, in verse 39, where Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind, provoking them to say, are we also blind? It's going to say some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? At which point Jesus is going to conclude the chapter in verse 41 by saying, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. Evidence of the fact that, even though they're claiming to see, they're really blind, is the fact that in the middle of their dispute with the man who was healed, they're going to claim to be, in verse 28, disciples of Moses, which once again is going to prove to be untrue because of some things that Christ has already said. Understanding that back in the earliest chapters, quite possibly chapter 1 of the things that the disciples begin to talk about when they're questioned, could this be the Christ, as John is witnessing to him actually being the Christ, is some of the things that Moses prophesied. He seems to be, in my terms, checking some of those boxes. And so even these men who weren't known as being scholars were able to compare the little or the things that they knew about the prophecies of Moses to the Christ and say, this lines up with what John is saying as well. And so this might be the Christ. Likewise, Christ himself is going to say that Moses has a law and you all don't actually even follow that law. And so now we have two boxes checked as opposed to boxes being checked affirmatively showing that he is the Christ. On the other hand, we are saying that in spite of their claims to be the disciples of Moses, they're starting to check the kind of boxes that would suggest they are not actually Moses' disciples, understanding that they seem to be ignoring the parts of the prophecies that even the lay people can understand are pointing towards this Jesus being the Christ. And then likewise, the law of Moses, Christ is identifying, wait a minute, you're not doing the things that Moses said his people should actually be doing. Understanding why, once again, the concept of an identity crisis seemed to describe not only who they thought their father was in the previous chapter, whether it was God or Abraham, Father Abraham as a forefather, now claiming to be John's disciples, that identity seems to be more the product of their perception as opposed to their reality, seeming to likewise build on that concept of an identity crisis that we saw in the last chapter, where they seem to, over time, believe their own fiction to the point where they really did believe they were the sons of Abraham, possibly, and they really did believe that they still were the sons of God. This chapter seems to give us some nuance now that we're seeing that they call themselves the disciples of Moses, and Christ has identified some specific things that even the lay people know that they have departed from. It doesn't seem like they could accidentally look at themselves as being disciples of Moses when their lives are just so different from the things that Moses prophesied and called them to do in the law. But what happens is, over time, it can be a temptation that we can all slip into. We can fall into the temptation to look at heroes, people we don't know, or people who have gone on before us and idealize them in a way that actually tempts us to idolize them, not from the perspective of merely having reverence for them, but understanding that people who have passed on cannot speak for themselves anymore. And so much like we see the Pharisees here, having essentially adopted a version of Moses as the one who they are following, it's actually a version of Moses that they have created, understanding the ways that they have departed from the reality of his prophecies and his writings. This possible identity crisis, as I've labeled it, reminding me of what we saw Christ specifically say in Matthew chapter 15 when he described the way that his people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, understanding that they had gotten into the habit of teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. That's going back in the Gospels, but going forward to 2 Timothy. Paul is going to warn Timothy of days in which people will turn away from listening to the truth they will turn off into lies, accumulating for themselves teachers that will tell them whatever they want to hear. This seems to be a midpoint where we look at the way in which they have taken the reality of a teacher like Moses and reshaped him into the image of their own beliefs, which reminds me of why we sometimes say, like I often say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, similar to what Paul warned Timothy in 2 Timothy. God, please restore in us a heart to diligently seek and diligently follow the counsel and the life of the Christ so that we can overcome the temptation to worship a version of him that we might have created.